By July 1798, Napoleon Bonaparte had transitioned from the abyss of the Italian mountains to the scorching sands of the Egyptian desert, embarking on an expedition that was as much a scientific odyssey as it was a strategic gamble to strike at the British Empire's lifeline to India. After a grueling march from Alexandria, where his human machine was pushed to the brink by heat exhaustion, thirst, and the constant harassment of Bedouin snipers, Napoleon finally sighted the glittering minarets of Cairo and the ancient silhouettes of the Giza Plateau. Standing in the path of the French Army of the Orient was the elite Mamluk caste, a warrior elite that had ruled Egypt for centuries with a military system based on individual bravery and peerless horsemanship. Napoleon, ever the hyper-realist, understood that the internal order of the Mamluks was based on medieval chivalry, which could not compete with the mechanical logic of modern European infantry. On the morning of July 21, 1798, as the sun rose over the Nile, Napoleon addressed his troops with one of the most famous psychological alpha statements in history, declaring that from the heights of the pyramids, 40 centuries of history were looking down upon them. He identified the problem that the Mamluk cavalry under Murad Bey was the finest in the world, so he designed a plan of total defensive concentration by organizing his 5 divisions into massive hollow squares. Each square was a self-contained fortress, with infantry on the perimeter, artillery at the corners, and baggage and scholars in the center. This was the 5-step process applied to a desert environment. Napoleon's goal was Cairo. His problem was the cavalry charge. His diagnosis was the need for structural rigidity. His design was the infantry square, and his execution was a display of cold-blooded discipline. As the battle began, 6,000 Mamluks, dressed in silks and armed with Damascus steel, launched a series of thunderous charges against the French lines. It was a clash of 2 different world orders. The Mamluks rode with incredible courage, throwing themselves against the bayonets. But the French machine remained silent until the last possible moment. When the order to fire was finally given, the total concentration of force from the French musketry and grape shot created a wall of lead that decimated the Mamluk ranks. The Mamluks, unable to break the squares, circled the French formations in a desperate attempt to find a gap, but the squares simply shifted their fire to meet every threat. Napoleon then ordered a counterattack, sending his divisions forward to seize the fortified camp at Mbabe. The French infantry stormed the village with bayonets, driving thousands of Mamluks into the Nile, where many drowned under the weight of their own armor and the gold coins they carried in their belts. The victory was absolute. Murad Bey fled into Upper Egypt with the remnants of his forces, and the machine of the Mamluk state was effectively dismantled in a single afternoon. Napoleon entered Cairo as a conqueror and a shaper of a new Egyptian reality, bringing with him a commission of arts and sciences to document the wonders of the ancient world. The Battle of the Pyramids proved that the logic of the square was superior to the chaos of the charge, and it cemented Napoleon's believability as a commander who could adapt to any environment. He had moved from the alpine snows to the African sun and maintained the same level of aggressive persistence that had won him Italy. However, the external order was about to shift as the British Admiral Nelson was searching for the French fleet, a reminder that every alpha phase is eventually met with a counterforce. For now, the logic of the revolution had triumphed over the tradition of the East, and the Napoleonic legend had reached a new global dimension. Focus on the discipline, embrace the weight of history, and never let the enemy's individual bravery break your structural design. This was the secret of the pyramids, and the reason the Orient was now at the feet of the young general. With the Mamluk cavalry broken and the internal order of Cairo in a state of total collapse, Napoleon Bonaparte transitioned from a tactical commander to a grand shaper of an Oriental empire. On July 24, 1798, He entered the city of the caliphs not merely as a military occupier, but as a self-styled liberator who claimed to respect the laws of the Prophet and the traditions of the East. This was a masterclass in radical open-mindedness and psychological manipulation. Napoleon realized that to govern a population of millions with only 30,000 soldiers, he had to apply a design and plan that integrated French revolutionary ideals with local Islamic governance. He established the Institut d'Égypte in the palace of a fled bey, bringing together the 167 scholars, or savants, he had brought from France. This was the five-step process applied to nation-building. His goal was a French colony that would dominate the eastern Mediterranean. His problem was a hostile and suspicious population. His diagnosis was that cultural and scientific progress would bridge the gap. His design was the creation of a modern bureaucracy and the discovery of ancient history, and his execution was the rapid mapping of the Nile and the founding of the Description de l'Égypte. Napoleon began to systemize the tax codes, improve the sanitation of Cairo, and even explored the possibility of a canal connecting the Mediterranean to the Red Sea, a project that would eventually become the Suez Canal. He was building a state within a state far more exotic than the one he had created in Italy, yet the mechanical reality of his situation was far more precarious than it appeared. While Napoleon was studying the Rosetta Stone and debating with the imams of the Al-Azhar Mosque, the external order was shifting violently at sea. Admiral Horatio Nelson and the British Royal Navy had spent months hunting the French fleet across the Mediterranean, and on August 1, 1798, they finally located the French ships anchored in Aboukir Bay. What followed was the Battle of the Nile, a naval catastrophe for the French machine that saw their flagship, the L'Orient, explode and almost their entire Mediterranean fleet destroyed or captured. In a single night, the logic of the sea had overwritten the logic of the square. Napoleon and his Army of the Orient were now effectively prisoners of their own conquest, cut off from France, reinforcements, and news from the Directory. This was the ultimate abyss for a commander. He was stranded in a land of sand and plague with no way home, and a British blockade tightening around the coast. Any other leader would have succumbed to disorder, but Napoleon applied his principle of aggressive persistence. He famously told his officers that since they had no fleet, they must either do great things or perish like the ancients. He doubled down on his Egyptian machine, raising local regiments, building his own foundries for gunpowder, and preparing to march into Syria to preempt an Ottoman Turkish invasion. The believability of his destiny was now being tested in a vacuum. He realized that the big cycle of his career had hit a massive structural wall, but he continued to evolve his tactics to meet the challenge of the desert. The victory at the pyramids had given him the land, but the defeat at the Nile had taken away the horizon. Napoleon was now a king without a kingdom, a general whose only path forward was deeper into the unknown. Focus on the transition from scholar to survivor, embrace the isolation of the desert, and remember that when the machine breaks, you must build a new one from the scrap. This was the reality of the post-pyramid world, and the reason the Egyptian campaign remains the most romantic and tragic chapter of the Napoleonic legend.